There are things happening to you that no one would understand, coincidences that seem like messages, dreams so real they leave you confused when you wake up. A strange feeling that life is watching you back. You try to explain, but no one listens. They think it's an exaggeration, but something in you knows it's not. Carl Jung called this the beginning of individuation, when the unconscious begins to whisper through reality. You feel like you're becoming different, more sensitive, more aware, but also more alone. And that's where almost everyone gives up, because awakening doesn't begin when you understand the universe. It begins when the universe begins to understand you. And if this is already happening to you, don't leave here. What comes next may finally make you understand why you never fit in anywhere. There comes a time when the soul begins to move before the mind understands. You begin to notice small tremors in the fabric of reality. Coincidences so precise they frighten, dreams that carry messages you didn't ask for, sensations that warn you of things that haven't even happened yet. And that's when the ego panics. It calls what is perception paranoia. It calls the first touch of the self-madness. Carl Jung said that the unconscious doesn't sleep. It just waits for the moment when you tire of pretending not to hear. This is the beginning of individuation, when the veil between the visible and the symbolic begins to tear. You feel fear, but the fear is just the resistance of the old self. It's the soul saying, "Now it's up to me." And most people run away because answering this call is dying without dying. True spirituality begins when everything familiar no longer makes sense. The coffee tastes the same, but there's something different in the air. You notice the weight of empty conversations, the boredom of the same routines, the strange echo within you when you smile without meaning it. It's the self pushing the ego into the corner, demanding space. At this stage, many lose themselves trying to return to normal. They try to fill the void with pleasure, productivity, or quick-fix beliefs. But the unconscious doesn't shut up when ignored. It screams in symbols, an accident, a loss, an existential crisis. What seemed like bad luck is merely the push of the invisible. Jung called this the soul's need for self-realization. And the soul is merciless to those who try to live too small for what was born to be vast. Answering the invisible call isn't a mystical act. It's a gesture of radical courage. It's when you decide not to run away from what calls you from within. It's when you stop looking for answers and begin to endure questions. Individuation doesn't happen in temples or retreats. It happens in the middle of traffic, in the solitude of a room, in the silence after an argument that has broken you inside. It's at this point that awakening begins to hurt, because the unconscious wants to be born into full consciousness, and the birth of the soul always feels like a death. That's why few make it through. But those who do never return to sleep. And it's there, in this realm between the real and the symbolic, that the universe begins to speak to you, but not in words, but in signs. And it's precisely there that the secret language of the universe is born. When the ego finally falls silent, the universe begins to speak. But it doesn't speak out loud. It speaks in symbols, repetitions, unlikely encounters, numbers that repeat like cosmic pulses. The 11:11 on the clock isn't a coincidence. It's a mirror. It's reality winking at you, saying, "Wake up, I'm alive." Carl Jung called this synchronicity, the point where the invisible pierces the concrete. It's the self-testing, whether you've learned to listen to the silence. You think of someone, and they call you. You doubt a path, and a phrase on a billboard answers you. It's too subtle for the ego, but too direct to be coincidence. When you awaken, the whole world seems to begin to decipher you, and that's when you realize the universe isn't outside. It's the unconscious speaking to itself through your experience. But this language is demanding. It doesn't tolerate falsehood. If you try to force the signals, they disappear. If the ego tries to use the sacred to feel special, Communication breaks down. Synchronicity only flows when there is alignment with the self, when you are whole, without manipulation. It's like a spiritual radio station. The more internal noise, the worse the signal. That's why the universe seems mute to those who live distracted. It speaks in metaphors, but haste translates poetry poorly. Jung said that synchronicity is the collective unconscious moving like an orchestra, and only those who listen from within understand the music. It's not about looking for signs, but about realizing that your entire life is a sign. Everything that happens is a mirror of your psyche projected onto the world's stage. When you begin to perceive this language, the world becomes intimate. The falling leaf seems to answer your question. The wind changes when you reconcile with something. Even silence gains timbre. It's as if God has learned to whisper in code. And this changes everything, because you stop living in chance and start living in dialogue. The universe becomes a companion, not a setting. But this closeness also comes at a price. It demands constant lucidity. Awakened consciousness can no longer pretend not to understand. Every sign demands responsibility. Every coincidence carries a choice. And the more you listen, the deeper the call becomes. Until one day you realize that listening to the signs isn't enough. You must become the channel between opposites. And that's when the bridge between heaven and the abyss is born. The bridge between opposites. True awakening isn't about choosing the light. It's about enduring the darkness without losing yourself. It's easy to talk about spirituality when everything is calm, but what Carl Jung discovered is that the self is only born in chaos, at the point where pain and beauty meet. The transcendent function appears when you've tired of seeking balance and begin to endure imbalance without running away. It's the moment you realize that good and evil aren't enemies, they're brothers fighting within you. The unconscious doesn't want you to choose sides, it wants you to realize that both are you. Individuation begins when the ego stops wanting to be pure and accepts being whole. And this hurts because the ego is addicted to labels. It wants to be right, it wants to win, it wants to be good. But the self just wants to be real. Holding opposites is like holding fire and water at the same time. One part of you wants to destroy, another wants to heal. One loves, the other hates. One believes, the other doubts. The ordinary mind can't handle this conflict and tries to resolve it with moralism. But the awakened spirit observes without judging. It understands that suffering and love come from the same source, the unconscious trying to express itself in polarities. Therefore, when you feel guilty for hating someone you love, or when you cry and laugh at the same time, it's the transcendent function tearing you apart so the self can breathe. Jung said, "Paradox is one of man's most valuable spiritual possessions." So, the next time you feel a contradiction, don't correct it, contemplate it. It's the unconscious teaching you to dance between poles that the mind tries to separate. Over time, something changes. You stop searching for answers and begin to see meaning even in contradictions. What once confused you now expands. You understand that life is not dual, it is dialectical. It is an infinite conversation between the visible and the invisible. And when this bridge stabilizes within you, everything changes. External conflicts lose strength because you realize that the enemy out there is only your projected shadow. And from that moment on, you begin to dream differently. Dreams cease to be noise from the unconscious and become communications from the self, the symbol itself speaking to the symbol. And it is there, in this state between worlds, that the dreams that awaken the dreamer are born. When the body falls asleep, the unconscious awakens. It is in this nocturnal silence that the self speaks the world's oldest language, dream. But for those who are spiritually awake, dreams cease to be metaphors, they become direct experiences. Carl Jung said that there are dreams we don't interpret, and there are dreams that interpret us. These are the ones in which you wake up different, as if something inside you had died and been reborn during the night. They are laden with symbols so vivid, they stay with you for days. A face that watches you, a house that repeats itself, a death that feels real. These are not daydreams of a tired mind. They are psychic portals opened by the unconscious to remind the ego that it is not in control. And when you understand this, you begin to sleep with reverence. There are people who spend their lives trying to control their dreams when they should learn to be guided by them. Because the lucid dream of those who awaken is not that of those who manipulate the scenario, but of those who realize that the scenario is alive. The self teaches silently, sometimes through a symbol, other times through an abyss. You dream of death and wake at peace. You dream of the sea and feel the call of surrender. You dream of childhood and realize that time is not linear, but spiral. Jung saw dreams as the purest mirror of the soul. Everything the ego represses during the day, the unconscious transforms into images at night. Therefore, those who dream deeply wake transformed, not by the beauty of the visions, but by the truth they reveal. And this truth is almost always uncomfortable. Start recording your dreams. Write down every symbol, every color, every sensation. Don't try to understand them immediately. Read them after a week and notice the pattern. They're always trying to tell you something the ego ignores. Dreams are the secret laboratory of individuation, where the unconscious rehearses your transformation before it happens in reality. It's there that you learn to die before death, to accept before loss, to be reborn before the fall. And when you awaken from such a dream, everything changes. Life seems like a reflection of what the unconscious has already experienced. But the most disturbing thing is realizing that over time, these dreams begin to watch you back. It's at this point that the psyche reorganizes, the ego loses its throne, and the self takes over. It's the beginning of the collapse of the ego's throne. No empire falls without resistance, and the ego is the most tyrannical of all. When the self begins to emerge, the ego despairs. It tries to maintain control, create stories, justify, rationalize. But spiritual awakening, as Carl Jung said, is the glorious defeat of the self. It's when consciousness realizes it's not the sun. It's just a mirror reflecting light. At this stage, you begin to observe yourself as if watching a character. You see fear emerging, pride defending itself, anger trying to prove a point, and for the first time, you choose not to react. This is the ego's greatest humiliation, realizing it's not indispensable. It screams, "I'm losing." But the truth is, for the first time, you're winning. Because what dies here isn't you. It's the theater that kept you trapped. The collapse of the ego feels like confusion, but it's actually purification. You may feel divided, as if there are two consciousnesses within you. One lives, the other observes, and that's exactly what's happening. Jung called it the ego-self relationship, the discovery that there's something greater watching you from within. It's like living on a split screen, half human, half infinite. At first it feels like spiritual schizophrenia, but over time you understand it's not dissociation, it's integration. You are the actor and the spectator, the character and the scriptwriter. The unconscious now no longer speaks only in dreams. It speaks in real time, within your choices. Every reaction, every thought is a mirror of your state of consciousness. And the most beautiful thing is realizing that even when the ego tries to sabotage, the self uses it as raw material for evolution. But there's a subtle danger here: the spiritualized ego. It disguises itself as enlightenment, boasting of understanding everything, of seeing beyond. It's the most seductive trap. The ego tries to steal the soul's merit and declare itself awakened. When this happens, the universe corrects with irony. It humbles you with forgetfulness, tests you with falls, and restores you to the humanity you tried to transcend. True spirituality doesn't place you above anyone, it makes you radically human. And it's when you accept this humanity that something mystical happens. Ordinary life begins to reveal itself as an ongoing myth. Work, love, suffering, nothing is more random. It's the self enacting the sacred in the ordinary. And that's where the next portal opens, living the personal myth. There comes a point when life ceases to be mere biography and becomes mythology. Carl Jung said that the greatest tragedy of modern man is to live without his personal myth. It is at this stage that awakened consciousness realizes that every pain, every love, every loss and rebirth are chapters in a story much larger than the ego can comprehend. You begin to notice that patterns repeat themselves, not as punishment, but as a pedagogy of the soul. The difficult mother, the impossible love, the unexpected failure, nothing is random. These are archetypes enacting your journey of individuation. The psyche wants to make you a hero, not of the world, but of your own unconscious. It is then that you understand that everything that hurt you was trying to shape you. The personal myth is the secret script of the soul. It's written in your pain, your obsessions, and the coincidences that refuse to die. When you live unconsciously, the myth dominates you. When you awaken, you interpret it. It's like realizing that the villain in your life has always been your teacher in disguise. The rejection you cursed was the hero archetype pulling you out of passivity. The failure that humiliated you was the call to the wilderness. The breakup that destroyed you was the impulse to discover self-love, the sacred union of the animus and anima within you. This is what individuation is, transforming suffering into symbol and symbol into consciousness. When you understand the myth, suffering ceases to be punishment and becomes initiation, but living the myth requires responsibility. The self doesn't play games with those who pretend not to see. It will repeat the lesson until you stop blaming others and take the lead role. And when you do, everything changes. The ordinary becomes a ritual. The everyday becomes sacred theater. Life becomes a mirror, and you begin to recognize in others the same archetypes that inhabit you. The tyrant, the healer, the martyr, the lover. All are fragments of the same collective unconscious, dancing within and without you. It is in this recognition that compassion is born, not from morality, but from perception. And then a new weight begins to emerge. Because seeing the myth is seeing too much, and seeing too much is a burden few can bear. This is when the next stage approaches, the weight of expanded vision. Seeing is dangerous, because once consciousness awakens, it never goes back to sleep. Carl Jung said that light shines only where there is enough shadow to sustain it. And when that light shines within you, the world loses its superficial charm. Ordinary conversations seem like noise, ambitions seem childish, social games nauseate you. This is the price of vision, realizing how unconscious everything is. You begin to see the wounds behind smiles, the fear disguised as virtue, the loneliness hidden in performance. Real spirituality doesn't leave you light, it leaves you lucid. And lucidity is a burden because it lifts you out of comfortable ignorance. The ego longs for unconsciousness, but the self no longer allows return. What has been seen cannot be unseen. Over time, you learn to be more silent, not out of arrogance, but out of compassion. You realize you can't push others to awaken. Each person has their own soul clock. The collective unconscious moves in tides, and your wave arrived first. That's why sometimes the price of self-knowledge is loneliness. You begin to feel like a stranger in your own world. While everyone chases distractions, you search for meaning. While everyone shouts, you listen. And while the world celebrates appearance, you learn to venerate the invisible. This is the silent pain of the awakened, living between dimensions, present in the body, but exiled in consciousness. There is no return to the old blindness, and the new perspective weighs heavily because it sees everything the ego begs to forget. But the weight of vision is also the beginning of freedom. You begin to realize that suffering is merely the soul's training to bear more light. Each disappointment becomes a refinement, each loss a symbolic instruction. The ego calls it punishment, the self calls it purification. And as this clarity deepens, something changes. You no longer seek meaning, you embody it. Consciousness ceases to be an idea and becomes presence. It is the stage where awakening ceases to be an event and becomes a way of existing. But there is no going back from this state. What the unconscious has revealed can no longer be forgotten. This is when metamorphosis ceases to be a process and becomes a condition, the beginning of an irreversible transformation. There comes a point where awakening ceases to be a choice and becomes destiny. You try to return, but something inside you no longer fits into the old form. Carl Jung called this the irreversibility of consciousness. When the self awakens, the ego loses its right to command. And this is frightening, because the old self still tries to negotiate. It wants to maintain habits, people, masks. But the unconscious is relentless with those who have seen the truth. It destroys comfort to reveal authenticity. Suddenly, what once fulfilled you no longer makes sense. Food loses its flavor, pleasures lose their luster, success loses its zest. It's not depression, it's a detoxification of the soul. Life is tearing you from the surface to teach you to breathe deeply. And the depths are dark, but that's where the self turns on the light. Irreversible metamorphosis doesn't happen overnight. It's slow, like the death of a star, and equally luminous. The ego dies in installments, first pride, then control, and finally the illusion of separation. It's a solitary process, because no one can go through it for you. True spirituality isn't a collective embrace, it's an internal birth. You feel your psyche reconfiguring itself, the old layers falling away, the unconscious taking over. It's painful, but also sublime, because where the ego dissolves, the serenity of the self is born, silent, firm, timeless. And then you realize you're no longer the same. You're not better, just more real. Individuation doesn't elevate you, it deepens you. And what's born from this abyss is something that never dies. From this point on, awakening ceases to be personal and becomes collective. Each person who transforms themselves elevates the field of consciousness of all humanity. Jung called this collective individuation, the process of the global psyche recognizing itself through awakened individuals. This is why your pain is never just yours. Each shadow you integrate illuminates hundreds of others in the collective unconscious. Each truth you live opens space for others to live as well. You become a silent point of light amidst the global unconsciousness. And even if no one notices, the universe notices, because the self never awakens in vain, it awakens to serve. And this is where the next stage of the journey arises, the silent service of the awakened. The truly awakened one doesn't preach, they vibrate, they don't convince, they infect. Carl Jung said that the collective unconscious is not healed with speeches, but with presence. This is why those who go through individuation begin to radiate something that words cannot explain. The self, once manifested, acts silently. You enter a place and change the atmosphere without doing anything, not because you're special, but because you carry within you a peace won in fire. True spirituality doesn't shout, It whispers through those who have survived their own shadow, and that is why the awakened one lives like a beacon, still but lit. They don't seek followers, they seek coherence. They don't want to teach, they want to exist with such integrity that the simple act of breathing becomes an invisible prayer. This service is solitary because the world still doesn't understand the language of presence. The collective unconscious values performance, not frequency, but the awakened know, the quieter they are, the more the universe speaks. It's a mission without recognition, a priesthood without an altar. You realize that the purpose is not to shine, but to illuminate. And this requires detachment even from one's own light. The ego wants applause, the self wants anonymity. Your life becomes a symbolic offering. Every gesture, every silence, every choice is an act of alignment between the human and the divine. And that's precisely what transforms. You become a bridge between worlds, and this bridge doesn't need to be seen to support those who cross. Silent service is the invisible work of the awakened soul. But serving in this way comes at a price, the dissolution of the last vestige of identity. You realize you no longer belong anywhere, and paradoxically, belong to everyone. It is the point where the human and the eternal meet, where the self and the whole merge. The ego calls this solitude, the self calls it unity. And when this fusion occurs, something within you surrenders completely. The journey reaches what seems like the end, but it is only the beginning of a new way of being, living in a state of constant metamorphosis. Because awakening is not a point of arrival, it is a sacred madness in eternal movement. And it is there that the final chapter of this journey is born, the sacred madness of metamorphosis. Awakening is not light and peace, it is collapse and rebirth. It is when the ego collapses and the self takes the wheel without asking permission. Carl Jung said that he who looks outside dreams, he who looks inside awakens. But he also warned, looking inside is dangerous, because there are no certainties there are abysses, and each one must go through their own hell to find heaven again. Sacred madness begins when reason bows before mystery. You no longer try to understand, you feel. You no longer seek control, you surrender. And this surrender is the pinnacle of consciousness, when the unconscious and the self look at each other without masks. The rational mind calls this delirium, but it is revelation. It is the moment when the human being discovers that God has always been a reflection within them. The final metamorphosis is paradoxical. You lose everything you believed yourself to be and gain what you always were. The ego dies, but you remain simpler, more naked, more truthful. It's like waking from a dream of identity and realizing the character never existed. The self takes over, and life ceases to be a personal narrative and becomes an expression of one's own unconscious. You become a living channel of what Jung called symbolic reality. Everything acquires meaning, a look, a fall, a tear. Sacred madness is this constant awareness that everything is a message. You stop interpreting the world and begin to inhabit it as an extension of your soul. And while this seems liberating, it is also devastating, because complete lucidity is a form of helplessness. But it is in this helplessness that true freedom is born. Awakening doesn't place you above humanity, it places you within it, so deeply that you feel the world's pain pulsate alongside your own. This is when compassion becomes instinct, and even without words, you understand. There is nothing to achieve, only to be. This is when consciousness retreats into silence, and spirituality ceases to be a search and becomes a breath. The soul recognizes itself in everything, in the shadow, in the flower, in the fall, in the chaos, and you finally understand. It was never madness, it was transformation. The unconscious was simply trying to become conscious through you. And so the cycle ends, not with answers, but with an echo. Awakening is eternal. Maybe you still feel like you're losing yourself. But what if, in fact, it's just what you're not dying? What if the loneliness that accompanies you is not absence, but a summons? How many more times will the universe have to repeat the same signal until you finally listen? You feel that time is different, that people don't understand you anymore, that the world has become too small for the soul you are becoming. This is not confusion, it is expansion. You're not getting weird, you're getting real. But awakening comes at a high price. He takes away all that is false and gives back what is real. And when this process starts to hurt, remember, the self is only born when the ego stops pretending. Now tell me, do you really want to go back to sleep? Or will it go all the way? If this tore you up inside, sign up now, because that was just the first cut.